Welcome to Gee Whiz in Agriculture. Today we'll explore what's bugging you. Here's your host, Carla Nichols.
These things that fly around bother me. They bug me. Gee whiz, I feel like they're fighter pilots dive bombing me right here in the lab. Oh, gee whiz, you're here again already. Well, you know, there's a lot of things that bug me, but certainly pests are one of them. What bugs you? I bet a lot of you are saying my little brothers and sisters. Maybe you're saying homework bugs you. Well, today on Gee Whiz in Agriculture, we're going to talk about entomology, which is an entire field of science that's devoted to the study of insects and arthropods. And really, how do they interact with people and with each other? Well, bugs are really some of the most successful creatures on Earth when you think of them, and they interact with people in a wide variety of ways. Most of us think of the bad aspects of them, like getting stung by a bee or swatting at flies, but there are also some very useful insects that help people out in a variety of ways as well. Think for a minute of something like honey. Honey is one of the two substances in nature whose sole purpose is for food, the other one being milk, and certainly humans do consume both milk and honey. And, well, of course, there's some other natural favorites of people as well, like one of my personal favorites, chocolate-covered ants, another food source as well. Well, entomology is the study of insects, and it's very important to agriculture, and that's really some of the things we want to talk about today. The interaction of insects with crops and animals is something that we really need to worry about and think about and use to our advantage. There are some things that hinder production of our foods, like potato beetles and aphids, and then we have mosquitoes that carry diseases to livestock and things along those lines. On the other hand, insects can be helpful when we think that we need bees to pollinate things like fruit and vegetable crops. It is estimated that 40% of the world's food production on an annual basis is lost every year due to pests. And this is in production and storage of the food both. So it's a very economically important thing to know about entomology in agriculture. Insects are also involved in medicine, and we've got medical entomologists that deal with things like insects that carry Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Lyme disease, and things along those lines. So the science of entomology deals with all these aspects. I see we've already got some questions out there. Really good. I love to see so many young people interested in questions about the topics we're discussing. So let's see what a few of your questions are.
Do insects have houses?
Yes, I think insects have houses because if they did not, they'd get wet in a rainstorm or cold in a snowstorm. Can insects give directions?
Yes, because some insects don't have eyes and they might just bump into trees or something.
What can you say good about insects?
Yes, you can say good things about insects because ants and other insects can be pets.
How can insects keep from being eaten?
Some can crawl into holes and some can camouflage with where they're living.
Do insects use tools?
One insect that uses tools is the ant. He uses pincers to carry crumbs back to his nest.
Well, Well, I'm going to need a lot of help answering all these questions because entomology is just such a big field and I don't know all the answers as far as these questions you just came up with. So with me today is Dr. Lee Townsend with the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, and Dr. Townsend is an entomologist and studies really a lot of these different aspects. And Lee, how do all of these bugs really fit in with agriculture?
It's a whole complex of things. You talked about problems with them in production of crops and how they can feed on the crops that we're trying to grow. They bother things that we have during storage, and we tend to think of them as annoyances or pests. But one of the real important things that comes out is we can use insects to control other insects. We can use them as biological controls. They're very important also in the food chain. Insects are important food for many birds and frogs and a lot of different animals, and one of the things that they have to do is stay off the menu.
Well, that, is something I'd certainly be concerned about if I was a bug. How exactly are some ways these insects can stay off menus, not only for us, but somebody else?
They have used a lot of different ways in evolution, and we'll look at some of the different types of things that insects have done. One of the first and simplest things to do in terms of staying off the menu is escape. And if we look at these grasshoppers or crickets, we see very large jumping legs that allow them to get away quickly if there's a creature that's coming in after them to make a meal of them. Flies with their wings can move away very rapidly, and the hard-shelled beetle is another way of protecting itself. So simple escape is a big way of dealing with it. Now, the next thing, can you still see me?
Yeah.
Here I am. Camouflage. By blending in with the surroundings, many insects can avoid being on the menu. This particular insect blends in just like a leaf, even to the point that it has ribs and veins on its wings, and if it sits on the right tree, it can keep from being eaten. We can see a number of other examples. We've got a walking stick that's common in the woods in Kentucky in the fall, blends right in like a twig and moves very slowly, and a couple of moths that fly at night, so as they rest during the day, they blend in on the bark and places that they hide. Now, you can hide, but what if someone finds you? You may try to scare them to keep them from making a meal of you, and here are some ways that they do that. We saw the hornworm moth earlier and it blended in with the bark on a tree, but if it moves its wings just a little bit, it exposes some orange spots on its back. Here are some other moths with orange markings and a great big beetle that looks like it has eyes. So if you were a small little mouse crawling around and getting ready to eat something and saw eyes like that, you would probably decide to leave. Now, camouflage is pretty good, but there are some other ways. And if you have a good system of protecting yourself, you want people to know it. So you might have a bright marking, and we see that with many things like the bees and wasps and things that sting. The velvet ant with its red and black markings, the yellow and black that we see on bumblebees and different kinds of wasps and hornets are all ways of calling attention to insects and other things that may eat them. Say, leave me alone, because if you bug me, I might sting you. One of the most interesting things is maybe you don't have a stinger or a way of protecting yourself, but you can act like you do, and in this case we see mimicry. At the top we've got the familiar milkweed butterfly or the monarch butterfly. It feeds on milkweed plants and it picks up some chemicals in it that works as a protection, makes them taste very bad if birds try to eat them. Next to it is a small viceroy that has the same color pattern and tries to make birds think that it's going to taste bad, and it escapes being eaten. Some other things like these flies try to look like bees and wasps. Lots of ways to try to stay off the menu, Carla.
Okay, who are a few of these friends you brought along with you?
We've got a number of things. Since we're talking about arthropods, we'll start out with a good example in that we've got a nice tarantula with its hard exoskeleton and its 8 legs. A relative of insects, but has a little bit more in the leg department and fewer body parts.
Well, you can keep him right there as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if I like this fella or not. Oh no,
we'll
these
be
get
talking
worse.
about how old many insects are as we get on into the program. And here's an example of one that was probably around when the dinosaurs were active, the old hissing cockroach.
Well, they make a lot of noise, but we had a lot of questions really from the students, and I think it's really time to go out on location, Lee, and talk about some of those other questions that we had as well.
Let's go. Insects are a member of a group of animals called arthropods. Today we're going to be using some displays at the Living Arts and Science Center in Lexington, Kentucky to talk just about what insects are and some of the features that we use to recognize and identify them. Arthropods are characterized by having some of the features that are really apparent on this nice healthy tarantula. They have segmented or jointed legs. You can see the segments are subdivisions of the legs. Arthropods also have a hard external skeleton called an exoskeleton. This external skeleton supports the muscles. It protects especially from water loss, which is a very important thing that insects and arthropods have to keep up with. We can use the structures on these creatures to identify them and also to tell what role they may play within the environment. Insects are among the most successful animals on Earth. And if we look back into the fossil record, we can see evidence that insects and their ancestors were active at the time that dinosaurs roamed the earth. The features of a segmented body and the hard exoskeleton of these creatures made them good things to become converted into fossils. One of the most successful insects has been this hissing cockroach. This hissing cockroach lives in the tropical parts of the world and has changed very little from the time that dinosaurs were active. It has the basic insect body plan, the head, the thorax, which contains the legs, and if it's a winged creature, also the wings, and the segmented abdomen that primarily carries the digestive tract and the reproductive organs. This is the very simple fundamental body plan, and all of the parts are relatively easy to recognize. With some insects, during stages of their life, the typical insect features are not as readily apparent, and in many cases they look quite different during the early part of their life than they do when they're full grown. The features of insects are not as readily identifiable on this hornworm caterpillar. If we look closely, we're able to see the head or first major body region. As we look underneath, we can see the 3 pairs of true legs that show the thorax. The long abdomen contains the reproductive tract and the digestive system, and in this case, because it's a long insect, there are some extra legs on the underneath side to help it move around on foliage and to feed on the plant material that it uses as its food. For this part of the program, we're at the Entomology Museum on the campus of the University of Kentucky in Lexington, and we'll be talking about some of the things that insects do and how they have adapted to specifically take care of certain jobs. As we look at people every day, we can determine a lot about what they may do for a living by looking at the tools that they may be carrying with them. Someone with a large screwdriver might be an electrician or a carpenter. A person with a scalpel or some scissors may be a surgeon, and they use these in their work. Other people, such as pharmacists or those that work in labs, may use things like medicine droppers to measure out liquids or transfer them. And computer repair people use specific little tools to pick screws out of hard-to-reach places where they've fallen. We can do the same thing with insects. We can tell what many of them do for a living by looking at the tools that they happen to carry around on their body. And these adaptations have occurred over a long period of time, selecting out ones that are specifically good for certain chores. If we look at the head of insects, the sensory and eating section and where the brain is located on insects, we're looking at the adaptations for a grasshopper, the basic standard head, and we see the chewing mouth parts, the mandibles that act much like the scissors that someone may use as a surgeon. In this case, the mandibles are used like scissors to cut away plant tissue as the insect feeds. We can also see with some insects through their mouth parts, and this model of the head of a honeybee, we can see the lapping type tube that's on the mouth parts that's used to gather the nectar that the bees bring back to the hive and convert into honey. This works very much like the eyedropper in terms of sucking up the liquid, and there are many insects with sucking mouth parts that use this type of arrangement. We can think of mosquitoes and plant bugs as examples of that. In addition, these bees also have the chewing type mouth part that the grasshopper had, because they have a lot of jobs to do around the hive in forming wax, in feeding the small larvae of the bee that are in the cells inside the hive, and these make excellent tools for doing that. Look next at an insect that, by looking at its body shape and form, what might we think it does? It's certainly an unusual looking insect. It's very flattened if we look at it from the side. It's very streamlined, and if we were to look very close at the legs on the underside of the body, we would see a lot of very fine bristles, and we would see that the legs are flat. This insect lives in the water. It uses those flat legs and the fringes on them to row or swim its way through the water. So that gives us an idea of the habitat that it can live in. And actually, if we look back on the tip, there are some small breathing straps. This insect goes up to the surface of the water to get air and then carries that air with it as it moves around below the surface. Now, by looking at the head region, we can get some other ideas of what this creature may do. First of all, notice how large the eyes are. You can see the very large reddish-brown shiny eyes on the front of the head, and the mouth part is a very sharp, pointed beak. What do you think this insect must do for a living? If you guessed that it was a predator or a hunter, you're right. The large eyes are important in finding prey, and the sucking mouth part is used in order to feed on the insects that it catches underneath the water. Notice on the front of the insect it has very strong legs. The front legs are used for not only swimming and moving through vegetation, but for reaching out and grabbing the prey that they feed on. So we can tell a lot about this insect, where it lives and what it may do for a living, simply by using our powers to deduce from what we see. Other things that we may see with insects are how they move around. In this particular case, the large, muscular hind legs of this grasshopper give us the clue that it can hop or jump. What about some other insects that are able to move this way? Fleas are one. We think of fleas as hopping insects, and also flea beetles that feed on plants. So they can use this as a means of escape, to get away. Other adaptations that are very important come in the group of insects known as the beetles. Beetles are among the most successful types of insects in the world because they're in large numbers. There are many different kinds, and one of the primary things about beetles that makes them so successful is the very hard wing covers on the outside of the body. This protects the valuable and very fragile flying wings that are underneath here. With our friend the fly, we can see that its clear wings are out and exposed, and they could be easily torn or damaged. But with the beetle, it has the hard covering over the wings that helps protect it. Also, by having this hard area over the body, the beetle is protected from birds and other kinds of damage, and we can see in a succession of different types of beetles that they all are recognizable by having the same type of features, the hard wing covers. We can find out something about how much sensory input insects get by looking at the antennae. These are the feelers or antennae on the front of the head of insects, and if they're very large, long antennae, we think that they must be important in determining where food is and looking for mates and things like that. This fly has very small antennae, so it must not use its sense of smell or detecting chemicals in the air as much, but it does have very large eyes. As we look through insects and their adaptations, we can tell a lot about what they do for a living, and use our powers of reasoning to be a detective by taking the evidence that we can find and determining what the life of that creature is likely to be. Probably most people recognize that many insects do have a place that they live. The honeybee is the prime example. They live together in hives, which many people have seen, and occasionally you'll see swarms out in nature. This is a group of social insects that live together. They go out and collect nectar, bring back pollen, and establish a community in which they live and rear their young. Another example of insects that build their own home and live together are the paper wasps and hornets. This familiar hornet's nest is a sight we see frequently in the fall when leaves drop off the trees. The hornets that make this nest chew the bark off of twigs and limbs, add some saliva to that, and make the paper that contains the envelope of the nest as well as the comb that is inside. Perhaps hundreds of years ago, people watched paper wasps at work and got the idea for making the paper that we use today. The inside of the hornet or wasp nest is very similar to that of the honeybee. There are the cells in which the young are raised, but in the case of wasps and hornets, they're bringing in such things as caterpillars and spiders to feed their young. A group that works together, the wasps and hornets use their sting to paralyze the prey or food items that they bring back to the nest. Some insects, as well as mites, have homes as well, but they must be lazy because they fool the plant into making the home for them. What we're looking at here is a series of plant growths called galls. This is abnormal or irregular cell division on these limbs and twigs that is a result of a chemical that's produced by the insect or mite that happens to be in the center. The gall provides a protected place in which to live. It also surrounds the insect with food. While these things look harmful or like a nuisance, they don't harm most of the plants on which they grow. Galls can occur on twigs and limbs as well as on the leaves. Some insects secrete their own home or covering, and this is the case with many of the scale insects. Some of them produce very white or obvious homes like these pine needle scales. Other scales blend in well with the background and serve as a protection or camouflage. These scale secretions give some protection against natural enemies and make a place under which the insect can live. Insects are an important part of our life, even though we may go for days without seeing a single one. Some insects are competitors for food. They'll feed upon the foods within our gardens. They'll feed on food that's being produced that we get through the grocery store. They can annoy our pets by having fleas that will bite. We can have disease problems that occur from mosquitoes that can carry diseases from person to person. These diseases can be very serious and even keep parts of the world from being developed as they should. While we tend to think of insects often as pests, only a small portion of the million different species in the world actually affect us or are a problem. Many species are helpful to us, and we're beginning to learn how to use them to make a better life for us. By using insects as biological control agents, we can control insect pests and keep them below damaging levels. We can also learn practices that will keep these beneficial insects present rather than reducing their numbers. Also, insects are important in the environment, not only as a part of the food chain, but also as recyclers. We think of termites often as pests around the home, but in fact in nature termites are recycling fallen trees, releasing the nutrients in them and letting them enter the food chain again. Insects are the most numerous and successful group of animals on the earth. They affect us every day. The way we learn to live with them and learn to use the benefit of the services that they provide, such as pollination, makes for a better life and helps us to understand the importance of the science of entomology. Well, we covered a lot of ground on that trip. We've got a few things to finish up with. One of the projects that many schools go through is an insect collection, and I've got some help here in terms of an expert to help us talk about collection today. A 4-H'er, Jason Hedrick. He's from Monroe County, Tompkinsville, Kentucky, and that's right down on the Tennessee line. Jason is 13 and has been involved in the 4-H entomology project. Jason, what does it take to be a good insect collector?
Well, it takes patience and the will to collect insects.
Okay. Where are some good places to collect? Where do you go when you want to find some nice things to put in this collection you have?
When I collect insects, I usually go out in fields or my backyard or the woods is where usually I find them.
What kinds of things do you really need to get started in collecting?
Well, when you get started collecting, you need a killing jar so you can kill them, and you need like traps and storage boxes.
Speaking of traps, you've got an interesting thing right here. Tell us about this. What does it do for you?
Well, it's a light trap, and you set it out at night. See, you got your extension cord, and you've got a light bulb and a light fixture, and you put a funnel and a Coke bottle underneath it, and when the moths start flying around at night, they will land down in here, but they will fall because it's so slippery, and they will go down in the paper, and it's a good way for you to catch moths.
Okay, so you can empty that out and then begin to put them in your collection. What other kinds of things do you get besides moths in there?
I've got beetles, you know, flying beetles, stuff like that at night.
So when you want to just do something else for a while, you can still get some insects collected. Now, one of the things you do after you collect insects is try to identify them. And I know in your 4-H projects that have gone to the state fair, you have had them identified. How do you go about doing that?
Well, when I identify them, I usually go by, I look up in the encyclopedia, or I use my project books, or I go to my local library.
Okay. Now, you've got a number of things in your collection here, and all of these insects are on pins. Is that a hard thing to do?
Well, some of them are because they're so fragile, you might end up breaking them when you pin them.
You've got a lot of white pieces of paper on here. What do those do?
The white pieces of paper tell you how old they are when you caught them and what their names are.
Okay, so you've got those organized and on pins, and I see a number of familiar ones. Is there anyone in here that you remember better than another in terms of what it took to catch it?
Well, this one right here, it was my first bug, and I caught it at a lake.
Okay, looks like a nice dragonfly there that buzzes around. We talked about the monarch butterfly that we should be seeing pretty soon flying back out to the north. And are you going to be collecting this summer again?
Yes, I'm going to continue on collecting.
Now, I understand that you've got another family member that's going to get into the insect collection business too.
Yeah, my brother, he's in his first year.
Okay, so you've got some tips that you can give him in order to do a good job of collecting. Your 4-H projects, using the encyclopedia, the library, there are a lot of resource materials around that you can use to help you identify, to see where to collect, and there are a lot of good projects within the classroom in terms of identifying and cataloging these insects that can be a real benefit to us. The science of entomology contributes to agriculture. It also contributes to our everyday life and health. It's a good place that you can get into basic science, whether you want to be in agriculture or medicine or veterinary science. A lot of ways to go in order to keep your interest in entomology up. Now, in terms of these clubs, you can learn about them through your county extension agent, and also the bookstores will give you a good place to do that as well. We've covered a lot here. That's it for Gee Whiz in Agriculture. We're glad you could be with us.